Rome is often sold to us as marble sunlight and noble speeches. But near the great arenas, the city had a different atmosphere, practical, crowded, and intensely physical. Sawdust was scattered to help people keep their footing and to soak up whatever the sand could not. The holding pens carried the sour, unmistakable odor of animals. And when the crowd surged to its feet, 50,000 voices blended into one wave of sound that felt less like cheering and more like weather rolling through stone. Down on the arena floor, the person at the center of attention was rarely a hero in any meaningful sense. Sometimes they were a trained fighter. Sometimes they were a condemned prisoner dressed to resemble a figure from myth. What looked from the highest seats like a dramatic scene was often a real sentence carried out in front of an audience that had paid to be there. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. Thanks for joining me today. If you enjoy calm, story-driven history that explains how ancient societies worked even when the subject is uncomfortable, please like the video, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you do not miss our next episode. Today, we're stepping into the Roman arena to understand the engineering of spectacle, how Rome used architecture, scheduling, props, animals, and public ritual to create shows that were not only entertaining, but politically useful. We'll look at the Naumachii, the staged naval battles on flooded basins. We'll examine the animal events from hunts to executions by beasts. And we'll explore the theatrical punishments where myths were reenacted in ways that turned storytelling into a kind of state theater. This is not about shock for shock's sake. It's about understanding how a sophisticated civilization trained millions of people to accept violence as normal. It also helps to start where the tradition began. The earliest gladiatorial combats in Rome were not born as sports but as funeral offerings. In 264 B.C., Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva honored his father with what Livy later remembered as the first recorded gladiatorial fight in the city. The location was not a grand stadium yet. It was a public space, the Forum Boarium, surrounded by the everyday commerce of animals, carts, and market noise. The fighters were not celebrities with fan clubs. They were men compelled by status and circumstance, enslaved, captured, or otherwise controlled, trained to fight as part of a ritual duty the Romans called a munus, a service owed to the dead. In the early stage, the tone was closer to ceremony than carnival. But Rome had a talent for scaling things up, and once a ritual showed it could draw a crowd, it did not stay small for long. Long before Rome built permanent amphitheaters, southern Italy was already shaping the idea of organized combat as public display. In regions like Campania, contests connected to funerals and feasts blurred the line between commemoration and entertainment. Over time, the emphasis shifted. The point was no longer simply that someone died, but that the audience watched the struggle, the tension, the stamina, the moment of victory, the moment of defeat. Later, critics such as Tertullian looked back on this evolution with alarm, noting how quickly people could convince themselves that bloodshed was respectable if it was wrapped in tradition. Once an event becomes familiar, the mind stops asking whether it should exist at all and starts arguing only about whether it was staged well. Rome's political class noticed this early. Public games could stabilize moods, display generosity, and channel the energy of a massive city that could turn restless at any moment. Funding spectacles could be framed as religious devotion, a gift to the gods, or a celebration of a military success. But it could also be plain politics, a way to win approval, distract from hardship, and remind everyone who held power. Temporary wooden seating expanded organizers, improved timing and variety, and the city learned how to program a day of events the way modern producers program a broadcast schedule. What began as a family obligation gradually became a civic industry. Once the state stepped in, the scale changed. The violence became regulated, planned, advertised, and repeated. By the 1st century CE, the arena had widened far beyond gladiators. Animals became central to the Roman imagination of spectacle. When an event was framed as a hunt, it was called a venatio. When it was framed as a sentence where beasts were the instruments of execution, later writers used terms like damnatio ad bestias. The victims might be criminals, prisoners of war, slaves accused of rebellion, or people swept up in political storms. The animals themselves were part of the message. Lions and leopards from far provinces signaled the reach of empire, the claim that Rome could command nature as easily as it commanded people. And because these events were planned, the results were rarely left to chance. Animals could be weakened, provoked, or handled in ways that made the outcome more predictable, more dramatic, and more satisfying to the crowd. These animal events were not only entertainment, they were also a weapon in the competition of elite status, especially in the late Republic. Leaders like Pompey learned that a public show could act like a political speech. Without words, it displayed wealth, ambition, and control. Some performers were trained bestiarii men who fought beasts with specialized tools, nets, spears, and quick footwork. Art from the early empire shows this clearly: a fighter braced with a weapon, while an animal lunges the moment, frozen in stone and mosaic like a poster advertising danger. But not every person in the arena had chosen a profession. Many were there because the state put them there, and the point of their death was less about skill than about demonstrating power. A controlled, choreographed killing could say, in a single scene, what laws and threats struggled to communicate. Rome decides who lives, who suffers, and who is remembered. Across the empire, amphitheaters turned this logic into routine. A provincial city could mirror the capital, offering the same rhythms of excitement: processions, announcements, staged surprises, then the main bouts. Roman writers who disliked the games warned that the crowd was being trained. Seneca, in particular, suggested that repeated exposure to cruelty did not simply reflect a society's character, it reshaped it. If people cheer for humiliation often enough, humiliation stops feeling wrong. If people laugh at pain often enough, pain becomes background noise. And if the state provides those experiences as a public service, then the state is quietly teaching citizens how to feel. That is why the arena mattered. It was not only a place where people died. It was a place where an audience learned together what they were allowed to enjoy. Then Rome went further and staged war itself as performance. The Naumachii mock naval battles were among the most expensive and ambitious spectacles in antiquity. Water would be brought into basins or artificial lakes, ships would maneuver, and the crowd would watch something that looked like a miniature version of empire's greatest achievements. Julius Caesar staged a famous early example in 46 B.C., digging a basin near the Tiber and presenting fleets with real vessels and real weapons. The men fighting were typically prisoners with limited hope of survival. The audience did not come to witness a fair contest. They came to witness a demonstration. If Rome could create a sea where there was none and force strangers to kill one another for an afternoon's program, then Rome's authority did not feel like politics. It felt like destiny. Under the emperors, the spectacles expanded in scale and in symbolism. A new ruler could use games to announce his reign the way a modern leader might use a national ceremony as a statement of strength, order, and generosity. Augustus created an enormous basin for a Naumachia in 2 B.C., so large it needed dedicated water supply through the Aqua Alsiatina. Ancient sources describe warships clashing in formations and thousands of men pressed into service as crews and fighters. The purpose was not strategy. It was astonishment. It was the message that Rome had resources so vast it could afford to build an artificial sea for an event that would be drained and forgotten, all because the emperor wished it. The engineering itself became part of the spectacle. Rome's mastery of waterstone and organization turned into a form of theater. Sometimes the setting grew even more dramatic. In AD 52, Emperor Claudius staged a naumachia connected to the Fucine Lake. This event is famous for the line attributed to the fighters, often given as "those who are about to die salute you." Whether the phrase was staged or spontaneous, it captures the emotional structure of the show. The crowd watches from safety, the ruler presides at the center of attention, and the people doing the killing and dying are treated as replaceable. Naval battles also brought a different kind of danger. Water changes everything. Men can drown. Ships can splinter. Chaos can spread. And that unpredictability was part of the thrill. The audience could tell themselves they were watching history, war, or heroism, but the reality was that lives were being spent to produce a memorable afternoon. By the time the Colosseum opened under Titus in AD Rome had perfected the arena as a machine built for surprise. Some historians suggest that naval spectacles were performed nearby during early celebrations, and later emperors experimented with flooding spaces for dramatic effect, though the details remain debated. What is not debated is the broader pattern. Emperors repeatedly invested in spectacles that proved control over environments that are normally uncontrollable. Under Trajan, a century after Caesar, a massive naumachia arena was built near the Vatican Hill. Each revival of the naval show carried the same lesson. Rome could make land behave like sea, it could turn engineering into entertainment, and it could ask human beings to pay the price publicly for the emperor's grandeur. In these choreographed wars, Rome did more than entertain. It rehearsed domination as a public ritual, a performance where the empire always wins and the individuals inside the performance rarely matter. Yet, the most unsettling evolution of the games may have come from the blending of punishment with storytelling. By the time of the Colosseum's opening, executions were often scheduled around midday between major gladiator bouts. These meridiani were not always presented as simple sentences. They could be staged as scenes from myth, turning familiar stories into a kind of theater where the ending was fixed and fatal. To modern audiences, it can feel like an attempt to make cruelty artistic. To Roman audiences, it offered variety, surprise, and the feeling that justice and culture were happening at once. Martial, a poet who wrote about the inaugural games, described scenes that read almost like stage directions. In one famous example, an Orpheus figure entered a manufactured landscape with trees and rocks brought into place by hidden mechanisms. The set itself was a marvel. The arena could transform quickly from open sand into a stage that looked like a forest. The audience would recognize the myth and anticipate its emotional beat. But the arena did not use myth to inspire mercy. It used myth to build suspense, then to deliver a twist where suffering became the climax. The story's beauty became a tool. The familiarity of the myth made the scene more effective, not less. The audience was not simply watching a death. They were watching a story they had heard since childhood become real in a way that left no room for imagination. Some reenactments pushed boundaries even for ancient observers because they used animals and human vulnerability in ways meant to shock or amuse. One set of references involves the myth of Pasiphae, and sources hint at a stage scene involving a wooden cow and a bull built to imitate a scandalous legend for a crowd that enjoyed testing limits. We do not need graphic detail to understand why such performances are troubling. The underlying point is clear: the arena could take stories about gods and heroes and repurpose them into punishments. What should have belonged to poetry and reflection was turned into spectacle. In that shift, myth stopped being something people interpreted and became something the state used: a costume placed on a human being and then removed by force. Fire, too, became part of the arena's vocabulary. Texts mention the tunica molesta, a garment treated with pitch or resin used in certain punishments. Sometimes the staging borrowed from Roman heroic tradition, such as the legend of Mucius Scaevola, who proved courage through endurance of fire. At other times it drew on mythic suffering such as Hercules dying on a pyre. The condemned might be dressed for the role placed in position and then set alight while the crowd watched from a distance. Here again, the goal was not simply to execute. It was to produce a scene. Costume, story, and timing turned punishment into a program segment, making it easier for the audience to consume because it felt like narrative rather than reality. Writers who opposed the games tried to tear away that disguise. Tertullian, writing as a Christian under Roman rule, criticized how victims were mocked and displayed, treated like props, in a performance built around humiliation. His language is sharp, but his complaint reaches beyond one religious community. He is describing a culture where people could be turned into objects for public consumption. When a society organizes suffering as entertainment, the audience is not passive. The audience participates by approving, by laughing, by demanding more. Over time, that participation teaches people what they are allowed to feel and what they must not feel. Compassion becomes inconvenient. Curiosity becomes stronger than empathy. And the line between justice and amusement becomes hard to see. So as these legends were staged, the boundary between theater and execution collapsed. Some sources describe staged falls, meant to resemble figures like Icarus turning a warning about hubris into a fatal display. Others describe punishments arranged to echo betrayal, sacrilege, or defiance, with the moral lesson written into the choreography. The condemned became unwilling actors in a play where the state controlled every stage direction. In the Roman arena, myth was not merely read aloud or performed with masks. It was enacted through bodies under authority. And because it happened publicly, it reinforced a simple truth: the empire wanted everyone to remember Rome's power was not abstract. It was visible, scheduled, and applauded. Over time, Rome's arenas turned ritual into policy and spectacle into statecraft. Violence on sand, water, and fire became a form of messaging. Repeating one central idea, the empire held control over life, status, and fate. Emperors understood that crowds needed bread and public holidays, but they also understood that crowds craved emotion: surprise, fear, excitement, and the relief of watching danger happen to someone else. Organizers therefore faced constant pressure to raise the stakes. A larger animal, a stranger's set, a rarer performance, a story with a sharper twist. What began as a funeral ritual could expand into a public industry with training schools, supply chains, and a calendar of events that made the arena feel like a normal part of civic life. The cost of that system stretched beyond the arena floor. Capturing and transporting exotic animals from provinces was dangerous and expensive, and the demand for such creatures could affect local populations over time. Roman writers sometimes bragged about numbers, how many animals were displayed or killed, and those boasts were meant to show the emperor's reach. If lions could be brought from far lands, if elephants could be marched into an arena, then the empire seemed limitless. But moral critics asked what kind of society needs these displays to feel satisfied. Even in antiquity, thoughtful observers worried that repeated exposure to cruelty would dull empathy. They feared that people would lose the ability to be shocked, which is another way of saying they feared people would lose the ability to care. So when we ask what the arena truly was, we should see several layers at once. It was religious tradition because it grew from rites tied to the dead and to the gods. It was politics because leaders used it to build popularity and manage public mood. And it was education in power because it taught millions of people what the state could do and what resistance might cost. That is why the details matter: the beasts, the water, the mythic staging. Each is a different tool aimed at the same goal, to make authority feel natural and to make the human cost feel acceptable. Which spectacle best reveals Rome's approach to control the early funeral duels, the animal shows, the naumachie, or the myth-based punishments? Ancient critics left warnings that still feel surprisingly modern. Seneca described leaving the arena feeling worse, rather than better, more impatient, more self-centered, less gentle because he had spent the day among people who cheered for suffering. He saw the games as training for bad habits, a place where citizens could learn to treat life cheaply. Whether every detail of his judgment applies to every Roman, the insight is strong repeated exposure changes what people accept. When a crowd watches cruelty often enough, cruelty becomes ordinary. When cruelty becomes ordinary, it becomes easier to justify and eventually easier to repeat in other contexts. The arena, in that sense, was not only a place where bodies were tested. It was a place where a society tested its own conscience. The legacy of the arena is therefore not only architectural, it is also moral and psychological. The Colosseum still stands as a remarkable achievement of engineering, crowd control, and design. It remains one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth, a symbol of Rome's capability and ambition. But it is also a reminder that a civilization can be advanced in some ways and harsh in others. The same society that built roads and aqueducts also built systems for public killing. The same people who loved poetry and philosophy could cheer for humiliation when the program demanded it. When entertainment depends on dehumanizing someone else, the audience may feel thrilled for a moment, but the long-term cost can be a shrinking sense of compassion. Comment below with your insight. Do you think the Roman games were a unique product of their time, or do you see them as an extreme version of impulses that can appear in any society when power and entertainment mix? If you enjoyed this calmer, deeper look at the Roman arena, please like the video, subscribe to Medieval Spirits, and ring the notification bell so you will be here for the next story. History is not only marble statues and grand speeches. It is also the everyday decisions societies make about dignity, empathy, and what they choose to applaud. And when we study Rome carefully, we do not just learn what they did, we learn how easily people can be trained to accept it.